September 1st, 1939 wasn't the real beginning. Public history remembers that date as the spark. German tanks crossing into Poland, Britain and France declaring war 48 hours later, the moment the 20th century's deadliest conflict supposedly ignited. Standard accounts treat it as sudden. A dictator's gamble. A surprise attack that shocked the world into war, yet under forensic scrutiny, that clean narrative disintegrates completely. Poland was not the cause of World War II. It was the terminal event of a chain reaction that had been building for exactly 20 years. One financial shock and one diplomatic failure at a time. The war was not the mathematical breaking point of a decade-long structural rot. It was the breaking point of 2 decades of it, dating back not to a battlefield but to a negotiating table in Paris in 1919. What actually unfolded behind closed doors in the years between involves currency collapse, foreign debt dependency, institutional cowardice, and a series of calculated tests of Western resolve that Hitler passed one after another, each time with less resistance than the last. And the deeper you trace the mechanism, the more the sequence looks less like a series of isolated crises and more like a single continuous process, one where each failure created the conditions for the next. Consider the shape of it. A treaty signed in 1919 imposes financial terms on a defeated nation that its own architects privately doubted could ever be paid. That treaty triggers a currency collapse so severe that German citizens burn banknotes for fuel because the paper is worth less than firewood. The government that oversaw this catastrophe survives only by borrowing from American banks. A lifeline that looks like stability but is actually a second time bomb, wired directly to Wall Street. Then Wall Street breaks. And when it does, the loans get recalled. Unemployment in Germany spikes past 6 million, and a fringe political party that had barely registered in national elections a few years earlier becomes the second largest party in the Reichstag. That is the first 90 seconds of a 20-year fuse. Not ideology first, arithmetic first. Here is the structural reality standard account skip past. Every subsequent event in this chain follows a repeatable pattern. An aggressive act occurs. The international community that is supposed to prevent it, the League of Nations, then Britain and France directly, calculates the cost of intervention against the cost of inaction, and chooses inaction. The aggressor notices. The aggressor escalates. This cycle repeats itself with an eerie consistency from Manchuria in 1931 to Ethiopia in 1935 to the Rhineland in 1936 to Austria in 1938 to Czechoslovakia later that same year. By the time Hitler turned his attention to Poland in 1939, he had run this exact experiment 6 times and been rewarded 6 times. This redefines how the historical record should actually be read. September 1939 was not a decision made in isolation. It was a probability that had been rising steadily since 1919, compounding with every reparations payment, every currency collapse, every unenforced treaty, every diplomat who chose the appearance of peace over its substance. To understand why the fuse burned for exactly as long as it did, no longer, no shorter, you have to go back to the room where it was lit. Paris, 1919. A treaty designed, on paper, to prevent another world war. An overlooked clause buried in Part 5 of the treaty changed the calculation entirely, and almost nobody outside the negotiating room understood its full weight at the time. The Paris Peace Conference of 1919 was never a negotiation in the conventional sense. Germany's delegation was not invited to the drafting sessions. They were presented with a finished document and given essentially no room to counter its terms. The victors, France, Britain, the United States, and to a lesser extent Italy, arrived with fundamentally incompatible goals. Georges Clemenceau wanted France permanently secured against a resurgent Germany, having watched German troops occupy French soil twice in 50 years. Woodrow Wilson wanted a liberal international order built on self-determination and collective security. David Lloyd George wanted enough punishment to satisfy a British public baying for vengeance, without weakening Germany so badly that it collapsed into Bolshevism or ceased to function as a trading partner. These goals did not merely conflict. They actively canceled each other out, and the resulting treaty reflected that contradiction, too harsh to be accepted as legitimate by Germans, too lenient to permanently prevent German resurgence. The territorial terms alone stripped Germany of roughly 13% of its pre-war territory and about 10% of its population. Alsace-Lorraine returned to France, sections of West Prussia handed to a newly reconstituted Poland, all colonies confiscated outright. The military terms capped the German army at 100,000 men, banned an air force, and eliminated the general staff system that had run the Kaiser's war machine. But the clause that did the most lasting psychological damage wasn't military. It was Article 231. Article 231 assigned Germany and its allies full responsibility for causing the war. On its face, this was a legal mechanism, a foundation for the reparations claims that followed. In practice, it became something closer to a national indictment, broadcast to every German citizen as proof that their sacrifice, their death, their 4 years of total war had been officially declared an act of unprovoked aggression rather than a tragedy shared by all combatants. German nationalists seized on the clause immediately, rebranding it publicly as the War Guilt Clause, and it became one of the single most effective propaganda tools of the interwar period, reused, reprinted, and reinterpreted by every German political movement that wanted to characterize Versailles as a national humiliation rather than a peace settlement. Here is the detailed standard accounts under play. Several of the treaty's own architects privately doubted the reparations figure could ever realistically be paid. John Maynard Keynes, who served as a British Treasury representative at the conference, resigned from the delegation in protest and published a scathing critique arguing that the economic terms would cripple Germany without meaningfully benefiting the Allies, and that a starved and resentful Germany posed a greater long-term danger than a stable one. He was overruled. The final reparations bill, set in 1921, came to 132 billion gold marks, a figure so large that when converted to a modern equivalent, it approaches several $100 billion, extracted from an economy already devastated by 4 years of total war. The treaty's authors had built something structurally unstable and knew it. What they had not yet discovered was how quickly that instability would translate into something far more dangerous than resentment. A currency collapse so severe it would erase the German middle class's life savings within a matter of months. By the winter of 1923, a wheelbarrow was worth more than the cash it carried, and that image, absurd as it sounds, is the single clearest data point for how completely the German financial system had collapsed. The mechanism was direct, not accidental. Germany owed reparations payments in gold or foreign currency on a fixed schedule, regardless of the health of its domestic economy. When the German government fell behind on coal and timber deliveries in early 1923, France and Belgium responded by occupying the Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heartland, seizing factories and railways to extract the payments directly. The German government's response was to order a general strike across the occupied region and to keep paying the striking workers' wages by printing money it did not have. That decision detonated the currency. The numbers barely function as numbers anymore at this point. In January 1922, $1 US bought roughly 160 German marks. By November 1923, a single dollar bought over 4.2 trillion marks. Prices in Berlin were rising so fast that workers were paid twice a day so they could spend their wages before the value evaporated by evening. People burned banknotes for heat because the paper was worth less than the firewood it would have bought. A loaf of bread that cost 250 marks in January 1923 cost 200 billion marks by November. Here is what standard accounts tend to flatten into a single dramatic anecdote about wheelbarrows without following the deeper structural consequence. Hyperinflation did not strike German society evenly. It wiped out savers, pensioners, and the middle class almost completely, while debtors, including large industrial concerns, often had their obligations effectively erased by the collapsing currency. Anyone who had spent a lifetime building a nest egg in marks watched that nest egg become worthless in months. This was not abstract economic pain. It was the direct, personal destruction of exactly the demographic that had underwritten Germany's pre-war stability, the class most invested in orderly constitutional governance. That destruction fed directly into a second mechanism, more political than financial, the stab-in-the-back myth, or Dolchstoßlegende. This was the claim, circulated aggressively by nationalist and military figures, including elements close to former commanders, that Germany's army had not actually been defeated on the battlefield in 1918, but had instead been betrayed by civilian politicians, socialists, and Jews on the home front. The myth required an economic catastrophe to feel urgent and personal, and hyperinflation supplied exactly that. A population that had just watched its savings vanish was primed to believe its suffering was the result of betrayal rather than the natural consequence of losing a war. A young, then obscure political agitator named Adolf Hitler attempted to seize on this exact atmosphere in November 1923, staging the Beer Hall Putsch in Munich in a failed bid to overthrow the Bavarian government and march on Berlin. The putsch collapsed within a day, and Hitler was arrested and imprisoned. On paper, this reads as a footnote, a failed coup by a fringe figure, but it is worth pausing on the timing. The putsch happened at the exact peak of the hyperinflation crisis, and it demonstrated something Hitler would remember for the rest of his political career. Economic desperation created an audience for radical solutions that had not existed before. The hyperinflation crisis was eventually stabilized by the end of 1923 through a new currency and a renegotiation of the reparations schedule. But that stabilization came with a condition attached, one that would prove just as dangerous as the crisis it resolved. Germany's recovery was about to become entirely dependent on money borrowed from the other side of the Atlantic. Yet an overlooked feature of Germany's recovery plan converted a national crisis into a national dependency, and almost nobody in Berlin or Washington fully reckoned with what that dependency would mean once the money stopped flowing. The instrument was called the Dawes Plan, negotiated in 1924 under the direction of American banker and future Vice President Charles Dawes. On its surface, it looked like a reasonable compromise. It restructured Germany's reparations payments into a more manageable schedule, tied to Germany's actual economic capacity rather than the punitive fixed figure set in 1921. To get the German economy moving again, the plan arranged for substantial American loans to flow directly into German industry and infrastructure. Germany would use this borrowed capital to rebuild its economy, generate export revenue, and use that revenue to pay reparations to France and Britain, who would then use those reparations to pay down their own war debts to the United States. Look at what that arrangement actually was, structurally. It was a closed loop of American capital, flowing out to Germany, cycling through reparations to France and Britain, and cycling back to the United States as debt repayment. Germany's economic recovery was not built on domestic productivity finding its footing. It was built on being the first link in a circular credit chain, entirely dependent on the continued willingness of American investors to keep lending. For roughly 5 years, this arrangement worked, and worked well enough to earn its own nostalgic nickname, the Golden Twenties, or Goldene Zwanziger. Unemployment fell. German industrial production climbed back toward pre-war levels. Berlin became a cultural capital, associated with experimental art, cinema, and a level of social liberalization that startled conservative observers. Chancellor Gustav Stresemann pursued a foreign policy of reconciliation, securing Germany's admission to the League of Nations in 1926 and negotiating the Locarno Treaties, which appeared to settle Germany's western borders peacefully. To contemporary observers, it looked like the Weimar Republic had turned a genuine corner. Here is the detail that gets lost in accounts that treat the Golden Twenties as authentic recovery. American lending to Germany during this period was not primarily long-term investment capital. A significant share of it was short-term lending, money that could be recalled by American creditors on relatively short notice if conditions in the United States changed. German banks and municipalities had become accustomed to simply rolling this short-term debt over indefinitely, refinancing it again and again rather than paying it down, on the assumption that American capital markets would remain healthy and willing indefinitely. That assumption rested entirely on the continued strength of the American economy, an economy that, unbeknownst to German officials watching their unemployment numbers fall, was itself becoming dangerously over-leveraged through margin lending and speculative excess on Wall Street. Germany's recovery, in other words, was not insulated from American financial conditions. It was a direct extension of them, sharing the same underlying fragility, just one ocean and one credit chain removed. Stresemann himself, shortly before his death in October 1929, reportedly expressed private unease about how completely Germany's stability now rested on foreign short-term credit that could be withdrawn at any moment. He would not live to see exactly how right that unease was. He died on October 3, 1929. 26 days later, the New York Stock Exchange began the collapse that would sever the credit chain Germany's entire recovery depended on. The first margin call in New York took 11 days to reach a factory floor in Hamburg, and from that point forward, the two economies moved as one broken system. The Wall Street crash of October 1929 is conventionally told as an American story. Black Thursday, Black Tuesday, fortunes wiped out, investors leaping from windows in a mythology that is mostly exaggerated but captures the panic accurately enough. What conventional accounts underweight is the transmission mechanism that carried that panic directly into the German economy within weeks. American banks, suddenly desperate for liquidity at home, began recalling the short-term loans that German banks and municipalities had spent 5 years rolling over rather than repaying. Credit that Germany had treated as effectively permanent evaporated almost overnight, the consequences compounded with brutal speed. German banks, unable to refinance their own obligations, began calling in loans to German businesses. Businesses, unable to access credit, began cutting production and laying off workers. By 1930, German unemployment had climbed past 3 million. By 1932, it exceeded 6 million, roughly 1 in every 3 German workers. Industrial production fell by nearly 40% from its 1929 peak. This was not a recession in the ordinary sense. It was the complete unwinding of the exact credit architecture the Dawes Plan had built, collapsing in reverse at the same speed it had been constructed. Chancellor Heinrich Brüning, who took office in 1930, responded with austerity, cutting government spending and wages in an effort to preserve Germany's credit rating and continue meeting reduced reparations obligations. Whatever the technical merits of that strategy, its political effect was catastrophic. Brüning's government presided over the years in which unemployment reached its absolute peak, and the German public experienced his administration as a government actively deepening their suffering rather than relieving it. Here is where the financial data connects to the political data with a precision that should unsettle anyone treating Hitler's rise as primarily an ideological phenomenon. In the May 1928 federal election, before the crash, the Nazi Party won just 2.6% of the national vote. A fringe movement, 12th place among German parties, an afterthought. In September 1930, less than a year after the crash, with unemployment climbing past 3 million, the Nazi vote share jumped to 18.3%, making it the second largest party in the Reichstag. By July 1932, with unemployment near its peak, the Nazis had become the largest party in Germany, with over 37% of the vote. That is not a coincidence sitting alongside economic collapse. Overlay the unemployment curve and the Nazi vote share curve on the same chart, month by month, region by region, and they move together with a consistency that most political phenomena never display. The regions hit hardest by unemployment were disproportionately the regions where Nazi support grew fastest. Hitler's own campaign rhetoric during this period leaned heavily and specifically on economic grievance, attacking the Versailles reparations system, attacking the Weimar government's handling of the crisis, and offering the promise of national economic renewal alongside the more familiar ideological material. None of this means economic collapse alone created Nazism, or that ideology, anti-Semitism, and nationalist mythology were incidental. But it does mean the timeline is inseparable from the balance sheet. A movement that could not crack 3% of the vote in a functioning economy became the largest party in the country within 4 years of that economy's total collapse. Germany's domestic crisis, however, only explains half of what made 1939 possible. The other half was unfolding 6,000 miles away, in a chain of events that would teach Hitler exactly how far the rest of the world was willing to look away. In September 1931, a staged explosion on a railway line outside Mukden gave the world its first real test of whether the post-war order could actually enforce its own rules. And the world failed that test almost immediately. The Mukden incident was manufactured by Japanese military officers as a pretext, a minor, likely self-inflicted explosion on a section of Japanese-controlled railway in Manchuria, blamed on Chinese saboteurs, used to justify a full-scale Japanese military occupation of the region within months. Manchuria was not some marginal territory. It was a resource-rich province of China, and its seizure represented a textbook case of exactly the kind of unprovoked territorial aggression the League of Nations had been built to prevent. The League's response was to commission an investigation, the Lytton Commission, which took over a year to complete its report. When the report finally concluded in 1933 that Japan's actions were not legitimate self-defense and that Manchuria should be returned to Chinese sovereignty, Japan's answer was simply to withdraw from the League of Nations entirely and keep the territory. No sanctions were imposed. No military response was ever seriously considered by the League's major powers. Japan paid essentially no institutional price for the conquest and kept Manchuria as a Japanese client state, renamed Manchukuo, for the next 14 years. Consider what this sequence actually demonstrated to any government watching closely, and several were. The League of Nations possessed no independent military force of its own. Its authority depended entirely on the willingness of member states, principally Britain and France, to enforce its rulings through their own economic and military power. When the cost of enforcement looked inconvenient, that willingness evaporated. The League could investigate, the League could condemn, the League could not compel. 4 years later, the pattern repeated with almost identical mechanics, this time in East Africa. In October 1935, Mussolini's Italy invaded Ethiopia, one of the only remaining independent states in Africa and a fellow League of Nations member. The League did impose economic sanctions this time, a marginal escalation from the Manchuria response. But the sanctions deliberately excluded oil, the single commodity that could have actually crippled Italy's military campaign. Because Britain and France feared that cutting off Italian oil supplies might push Mussolini into open war, or push him permanently into alliance with Hitler. Ethiopia fell within 7 months. Emperor Haile Selassie's personal appeal to the League Assembly in June 1936, warning member states that their own security would be next if aggression went unpunished, was heard respectfully and then ignored. Here is the detail that connects both episodes directly to what followed in Europe. Hitler was reading these outcomes as data, not as distant news. German diplomatic and military circles studied the Manchuria and Ethiopia crises specifically for what they revealed about the actual, as opposed to theoretical, limits of collective security. The lesson available to any observer paying attention was consistent and stark. Unilateral aggression, pursued with sufficient speed and confidence, could be completed faster than the international system, could organize a meaningful response to stop it. Condemnation without enforcement cost the aggressor nothing. Hitler had spent the years since his release from prison rebuilding the Nazi Party, consolidating power, and rearming Germany in direct violation of the Versailles Treaty's military restrictions. What he had lacked, until Manchuria and Ethiopia provided it, was live confirmation of exactly how the rest of the world would respond when someone tested the post-war order's boundaries directly. In March 1936, he decided to run that exact test himself, sending German troops into the demilitarized Rhineland, and discovered the answer was almost identical to what Japan and Italy had already found. On the morning of March 7, 1936, roughly 19,000 German soldiers crossed into the Rhineland, and the French General Staff, possessing a mobilized force many times that size sitting just across the border, chose not to move. The Rhineland was not a minor technicality. Under both the Versailles Treaty and the separately negotiated Locarno treaties that Germany itself had voluntarily signed in 1925, the region was required to remain permanently demilitarized, a buffer zone intended specifically to prevent exactly the kind of surprise German mobilization against France that had happened in 1914. Hitler's own generals were deeply uneasy about the operation. Contemporary accounts from within the German High Command described the mission as carrying explicit orders to retreat immediately if French forces responded with any show of force at all. Germany's military at that point remained a fraction of France's in both size and readiness. This was not yet a confident aggressor. This was a calculated bluff run against an opponent Hitler had already learned, from Manchuria and Ethiopia, was unlikely to call it. France did not call it. The French government, wrestling with its own domestic political instability and reluctant to act without explicit British support, chose diplomatic protest over military response. Britain, for its part, was arguably less troubled by the move than France was. A notable strand of opinion in London held that Germany was, after all, only reoccupying its own sovereign territory, a framing that made inaction feel almost reasonable rather than dangerous. No mobilization followed. No ultimatum was delivered. Hitler's forces stayed. Here is the detail that separates this episode from the ones in Asia and Africa in terms of consequence. The Rhineland was reachable, actionable, and stoppable by conventional force that was already in position. French military planners later acknowledged in post-war assessments that a determined French response in March 1936 could likely have forced a German withdrawal and dealt a serious blow to Hitler's domestic political standing at a moment when his regime was still consolidating power. This was not a distant colonial territory. This was a direct violation on France's own border, and France still chose not to act. The following year, a parallel but distinct pattern unfolded in Spain, where a military uprising led by Francisco Franco against the Spanish Republic escalated into full civil war. Hitler and Mussolini both intervened on Franco's side, providing troops, aircraft, and equipment, transforming the Spanish Civil War into something closer to a live fire testing ground for the military tactics that would define the coming European war. The German Condor Legion's bombing of the Basque town of Guernica in April 1937 previewed, with grim precision, the kind of aerial terror bombing of civilian populations that would later become standard practice across the continent. Western democracies, along with the League, adopted a policy of non-intervention in Spain, a policy that Germany and Italy simply ignored while continuing to arm their preferred side. By 1938, Hitler had accumulated a remarkably consistent data set. Aggression, tested repeatedly against the current international order, had never once been met with decisive force. The Rhineland was recovered without a shot fired. Spain became a proving ground with no meaningful penalty attached. Manchuria and Ethiopia had already demonstrated the same lesson on other continents. Every single test had confirmed the same conclusion, and Hitler's next move would be his most direct one yet. Not testing a treaty's boundaries this time, but absorbing an entire sovereign nation outright. On March 12, 1938, German troops crossed into Austria to cheering crowds, and the annexation that followed happened so smoothly it barely registered as a crisis in London or Paris at all. The Anschluss, Germany's absorption of Austria, was explicitly forbidden under both the Versailles Treaty and the separate Treaty of Saint-Germain, both of which prohibited German-Austrian political union specifically to prevent Germany from recovering the territorial and demographic weight it had lost after the First World War. Hitler engineered the annexation through a combination of internal political pressure on the Austrian government and the threat of outright invasion, and when Austrian Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg attempted to hold a last-minute referendum on Austrian independence, Hitler simply moved troops across the border before the vote could occur. Austria was formally incorporated into the German Reich within days. Neither Britain nor France issued anything beyond formal protest. The absorption of an entire nation of roughly 6 million people passed with less international resistance than the sanctions regime imposed on Italy over Ethiopia 3 years earlier. This set the stage directly for the crisis that would come to define the entire Appeasement era. Hitler's next target was the Sudetenland, the German-speaking border region of Czechoslovakia, home to roughly 3 million ethnic Germans. Hitler's public justification echoed the language of self-determination that had shaped the post-war settlement in the first place. Germans, he argued, deserve the right to be united with Germany. The deeper strategic reality was that the Sudetenland contained Czechoslovakia's primary line of border fortifications and a substantial share of its industrial capacity. Its loss would leave the remainder of the Czechoslovak state almost entirely undefendable. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to meet Hitler in person 3 separate times over the following weeks, an extraordinary diplomatic effort by the standards of the era, culminating in the Munich conference on September 29th and 30th, 1938. The agreement reached there ceded the Sudetenland to Germany outright. Crucially, Czechoslovakia itself was not permitted to participate in the negotiations that determined its own territorial fate. The decision was made entirely by Germany, Italy, Britain, and France, simply presented to the Czechoslovak government afterward as a settled matter. Chamberlain returned to Britain and delivered what would become one of the most infamous lines in 20th century diplomatic history, declaring that the agreement represented peace for our time. Look at what that statement actually assumed. It assumed Hitler's territorial ambitions were limited, specific, and satisfiable, that the Sudetenland was the demand rather than merely the latest demand. Winston Churchill, at the time a backbench critic with limited political influence, offered a starkly different assessment in Parliament, warning that Britain had been offered a choice between war and dishonor, had chosen dishonor, and would get to war anyway. Churchill's warning was validated with uncomfortable speed. In March 1939, less than 6 months after Chamberlain's declaration, German forces occupied the remainder of Czechoslovakia entirely, dissolving the state and absorbing territory that contained no ethnic German population to justify the seizure under Hitler's own previously stated rationale. This was the moment the appeasement strategy's core assumption collapsed beyond any diplomatic defense. Hitler had not been satisfied. He had been informed with total clarity that Western powers would trade away an ally's sovereignty to avoid confrontation, and he adjusted his ambitions accordingly. By the spring of 1939, only one remaining obstacle stood between Hitler and an invasion of Poland, the risk of a two-front war against both the Western democracies and the Soviet Union simultaneously. That obstacle was about to be removed through an agreement between two governments that, on paper, represented opposite ends of the ideological spectrum. On August 23, 1939, two foreign ministers representing supposedly irreconcilable ideologies signed a non-aggression pact in Moscow. And within 9 days, the last strategic barrier to invading Poland had been removed entirely. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, named for Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov and his German counterpart Joachim von Ribbentrop, stunned observers across the political spectrum precisely because Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union had spent the previous 6 years defining themselves in explicit ideological opposition to one another. Hitler had built substantial portions of his domestic and foreign policy rhetoric around the threat of Bolshevism. Stalin's regime had spent years warning of fascist encirclement. On its public face, the agreement was a simple non-aggression treaty, each side committing not to attack the other. The document's real strategic weight was contained in a secret protocol, unknown to the public at the time, and only fully confirmed decades later, which divided Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence. Poland, specifically, was earmarked for partition between the two powers. The Baltic states, along with portions of Romania, were similarly allocated. This was not a peace agreement in any meaningful sense. It was a territorial division agreement between two powers preparing to seize what they had assigned themselves, with an explicit understanding that neither would interfere with the other's share. Consider what this pact solved for Hitler specifically. Since the aftermath of the First World War, German military planners had operated under the persistent strategic nightmare of a two-front war, the same scenario that had ultimately exhausted and defeated Germany between 1914 and 1918, fighting France and Britain in the west while simultaneously facing Russia in the east. An invasion of Poland risked provoking exactly that scenario again, particularly given that Britain and France had extended a formal guarantee of Polish independence in March 1939 in direct response to the occupation of Czechoslovakia. But a guarantee to Poland only functioned as a meaningful deterrent if the Soviet Union remained a hostile, unpredictable variable on Germany's eastern flank. The pact eliminated that variable entirely. With Stalin neutralized by treaty and, more specifically, by the promise of his own share of Polish territory, Hitler could commit his forces against Poland without needing to simultaneously defend against Soviet intervention from the east. Here is the detail that connects this pact directly back to the 2 decades of failure that preceded it, rather than treating it as an isolated diplomatic surprise. Stalin's own calculation in signing the pact was shaped by his justified distrust of Britain and France's commitment to collective security. A distrust built directly on the pattern established across Manchuria, Ethiopia, the Rhineland, and Munich. The Soviet Union had proposed collective security arrangements with the Western democracies earlier in 1939, and those negotiations had proceeded slowly and without evident urgency on the British and French side, partly due to lingering ideological hostility toward the Soviet system. Stalin drew a conclusion consistent with everything the previous 8 years had demonstrated to every government in Europe. if Western powers would not reliably commit to collective action, a bilateral deal that secured immediate territorial gain and bought time to rearm was the more rational choice available to him. With the pact signed, every structural precondition for the invasion of Poland was now in place. 2 decades of financial instability had produced a radicalized German public. 2 decades of institutional failure had demonstrated that aggression carried no meaningful cost. And a single treaty, signed by ideological enemies, acting on identical strategic logic, had removed the last variable capable of stopping the invasion before it began. On September 1st, 1939, at 4:45 in the morning, German forces crossed the Polish border. The fuse that had been burning since 1919 had finally reached its detonation point. The invasion itself, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic, mechanically efficient, diplomatically unsurprising, and over an opening campaign within weeks. That is precisely the point. By September 1939, there was very little left to decide. Every structural precondition had already been assembled, tested, and confirmed across the preceding 20 years. Trace the full chain back to its origin, and the mechanism becomes impossible to unsee. A treaty in 1919 imposed financial terms its own architects privately doubted could be paid, while assigning Germany sole moral responsibility for the war through a single clause that would fuel 2 decades of nationalist grievance. Those reparations triggered a hyperinflation crisis, so severe it liquidated the German middle class's savings within months, radicalizing exactly the demographic that had underwritten Weimar's stability. A recovery plan then rebuilt that stability on foreign short-term credit rather than domestic strength, creating a hidden dependency that nobody in Berlin fully priced into their sense of security. When that credit chain snapped in 1929, the resulting unemployment crisis tracked the rise of a fringe political party with mathematical precision, carrying it from 12 seats to the largest bloc in the Reichstag in under 4 years. That domestic collapse alone would not have produced a world war. It required an international system that had already demonstrated repeatedly and specifically that aggression carried no real cost. Manchuria taught that lesson first. Ethiopia confirmed it. The Rhineland proved it applied even to violations on France's own border. Austria showed that entire nations could be absorbed with nothing more than formal protest. Munich revealed that Western democracies would trade an ally's sovereignty for the appearance of peace. And the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact removed the final variable, a hostile eastern flank, that might otherwise have given Hitler pause. Every one of these episodes functioned as both a policy failure and a confirmed data point in Hitler's own strategic calculations. This is what standard accounts of Poland as a sudden, isolated act of aggression consistently miss. Poland was not a decision made in September 1939. It was a probability that had been climbing steadily for 2 decades, compounding with every reparations payment that went unforgiven, every currency that collapsed, every act of aggression the world declined to punish. None of this erases individual agency from the story. Hitler made choices. Chamberlain made choices. Stalin made choices. But the structural conditions that made those choices available and made their consequences survivable for the people making them were built decades before any of those men sat down at a negotiating table. A punitive peace created desperation. Desperation created radicalization. Institutional weakness rewarded aggression. And aggression, rewarded consistently enough, became policy. The uncomfortable modern relevance of this sequence is not that history repeats itself in any mystical sense, but that the mechanism is structural rather than personal. And structural mechanisms recur whenever the underlying conditions recur. Economic humiliation combined with institutional paralysis has produced radicalized politics before, and there is no law of history exempting the present moment from that same combination. So consider the actual question this history leaves behind, stripped of hindsight's comfortable certainty. At which of these dozen intervention points, Versailles, the Ruhr occupation, the Dawes Plan's hidden fragility, the Rhineland, Ethiopia, Munich, would a different choice have changed the outcome? And at which point had the structural momentum already become unstoppable, regardless of what anyone chose? That is the harder, more useful question than simply asking when the war began. If this kind of forensic reconstruction of history's supposedly settled turning points is something you want more of, subscribing keeps these deeper dives coming.